The paycheck felt lighter than the handful of earth I'd tossed onto my father's coffin. $300 gone for 3 days of mourning, all officially approved. My eyes traced the numbers cold and precise, no different than the dirt now covering my dad. No condolences, no explanations. Just a quiet, calculated betrayal. My untouched coffee sat cold, mirroring my hollow disbelief. If grief ever cost you more than it should stay with me, you're not alone, because this wasn't just about money, it was about respect, and I was ready to reclaim mine. For 10 quiet years at Westlake Consulting, I'd built my reputation like a gardener tending a delicate plant, patiently, deliberately nurturing trust until it took firm root. Clients leaned on me during crises, colleagues lingered at my desk long after office hours seeking guidance wrapped in quiet confidence. "Ask Talia. She always knows." They'd whisper. I took pride not in loud victories, but in silent dependability. Then Ryan arrived, crisp suit cufflinks glinting under harsh fluorescence. Every move precise as a surgeon's blade. His introduction echoed clearly in the conference room. "We're here to work. Smarter, faster, sharper. Feelings won't pay our bills." Our differences emerged subtly at first. Quiet friction, hidden beneath polite nods in the hallway. One afternoon, when our longest-standing client, Sarah, called, distraught, her voice tight, wavering, overwhelmed by a sudden personal crisis, I gently assured her we could extend deadlines. Ryan overheard, interrupting abruptly. His voice metallic, unyielding. "We're running a business. Talia, deadlines aren't optional." Another evening, as the office emptied into shadows, I lingered to comfort Emily, a junior analyst in tears over her first major mistake. Ryan spotted us checking his watch with pointed disapproval. The next morning, a crisp email awaited me. "Empathy is admirable, but billable hours matter more." Our quiet clashes piled up each interaction. A paper cut small, unnoticed by others, but stinging deeply. Conversations between us turned terse, his eyes always sliding past mine, dismissive yet deliberate. My kindnesses felt smaller. Each day diminished under Ryan's calculating gaze, now staring numbly at my paycheck, sliced thin by Ryan's merciless logic for 3 approved days mourning my father. I heard his words replay coldly. "Feelings won't pay our bills." Perhaps he was right, but at what cost? He'd finally pushed too far. Awakening a quiet determination in me he hadn't yet seen. It started with a meeting I wasn't invited to. A project I had shepherded from draft to launch, suddenly reassigned, no email, no explanation, just a blank space where my name used to sit. I found out by accident. An intern mentioned the project update over coffee, assuming I already knew. I smiled politely, nodded like it didn't matter. Inside, something cracked. Small, quiet, but irreversible. Days blurred after that. The steady erosion of place, of voice, of belonging. One afternoon, I returned from a client call to find my desk moved. No notice, no apology, just a sticky note slapped onto a monitor. Relocated per new floor plan. My new seat was tucked into a narrow corner, wedged between the back storage room and the humming vending machine. Out of sight. Out of mind. I stood there for a moment, folders in my arms, staring at the empty desk. On the abandoned surface, my old coffee cup still sat, the last dregs cold and untouched. No one had bothered to clear it away. It sat there like a monument, a marker of what used to be mine. Ryan didn't hide his new favorites, especially Daniel, fresh out of business school sharpsuit. A size too big, but ambition practically dripping off him. Ryan clapped him on the shoulder in meetings, laughed a little too loudly at his half-formed ideas, pushed his proposals to the top of the pile. When Daniel stumbled during a client pitch, fumbling stats I once had memorized backwards, Ryan waved it off with a grin. "He's learning," he said, voice warm. Exactly the kind of initiative we need. No such grace had ever been extended to me. 10 years of clean reports, successful launches, quiet late nights. reduced to background noise. The floor buzzed with new energy, the kind that didn't need me anymore, or pretended not to. I worked later now, not because they asked, because in the quiet, it hurt less. No half-heard jokes, no sidelong glances, just the soft hum of the vending machine, the cold light of the desk lamp, the slow cooling of another untouched cup of coffee. Each small cut bled into the next. Not enough to scream about, but enough to feel the slow drowning of everything I had built. This wasn't an attack. It was abandonment by design. And somehow that hurt worse, because it taught me a brutal truth. It's not the loud betrayals that break you. It's the silence, the emptiness where purpose used to live. I stayed quiet, collected the cuts, folded them neatly into the corners of my mind, not out of fear, not out of defeat, but because I knew even the smallest wounds left untreated eventually become impossible to ignore, and mine were starting to burn. By the time the office lights dimmed and the noise thinned into silence, I was still there, always still there. The late hours became a ritual, not for approval, not for attention, for survival. When the last elevator dinged shut, I stayed behind. The hum of the vending machine filled the corridors. A tired mechanical heartbeat. Fluorescent lights buzzed quietly overhead, casting long, faded shadows across the polished floor. That's when I moved. Soft, methodical, invisible. At my desk, I plugged in a small, unmarked flash drive, pulled project backups, archived email threads, saved meeting notes where promises were made and quietly broken. Each file slipped neatly into hidden folders tucked beneath layers of innocuous names. No alarms, no red flags, just the slow, careful gathering of truth. Outside the glass walls, the city stretched in blinking endless lines. Inside, only the sound of my own footsteps remained soft, deliberate, steady down the deserted hallway. At first, the weight of it all gnawed at me. The quiet betrayals, the steady erosion of a decade's work. But over time, the late nights became less about hurt and more about preparation. Each document saved, each email forwarded, each silence recorded. I wasn't powerless. I was patient. A security guard passed by once, nodding absently. "Working late again." "Ms. Hart?" I smiled, soft and unreadable. "Just finishing up some admin," I said, and the lie slid easy between us. Safe, harmless. Exactly what they expected from me now. Exactly what I needed them to believe. I copied client correspondence memos showing unauthorized decisions, edits to project scopes without approval. I saved evidence of missed compliance reports. Ryan had quietly signed off confident. No one would notice, piece by piece, the pattern built itself. Not a weapon. Not yet, but a foundation. Each evening, when I finally shut down the screen, I would walk the long corridor back to the elevators. My heels tapped a steady, solitary rhythm across the gleaming stone. Not rushed, not defeated. Each step spoke what my voice never did. I'm still here. I'm watching, and I am not done yet. Some nights, I'd pause by the big window at the end of the hall, look down at the sprawling city lights. Thousands of stories unfolding, thousands of people fighting battles no one else saw. And I would feel it deep under the ache. A slow gathering storm, not rage, not revenge, resolve. Not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon, the thread they thought they had frayed would pull taut. And when it snapped, it wouldn't just break. It would tear everything they had built apart quietly. Completely. The conference room was too bright, too sterile. Rows of chairs filled quickly, murmurs weaving into a low, uneasy hum. I chose a seat near the back, near the door. A habit now, Ryan stood at the front, sleeves rolled up just enough to look approachable, tie loosened, like he had just come from solving something big. He smiled, that tight mechanical smile. Before we move into quarterly updates, he said, voice smooth as glass. There's something we need to address. A concern about commitment. The air shifted. Chairs creaked as people sat straighter. My hands stayed still in my lap. Ryan's eyes skimmed the room until they landed on me. Just a flicker. Just long enough. Some individuals, he continued, seem to think that personal priorities excuse lapses in professional duty. Silence, sharp, cold. He clicked the remote. A slide popped up, performance graphs, deadlines missed. My projects, my work. Twisted numbers, half-truths. My stomach knotted, but my face remained calm. I didn't move. I didn't flinch. Ryan folded his arms, pausing for effect. We all have lives outside of work, he said lightly. But real commitment means knowing where your responsibilities lie, especially during critical periods. A few heads turned toward me, quick glances, some pitying, some curious. My throat burned, not from shame, from the violence of staying silent. I reached for my sleeve, adjusting the cuff with slow, steady fingers. A small, deliberate motion, my armor. My refusal to let him see me break. Ryan smiled again, as if satisfied. Let's move on, he said. Click. New slide. The meeting continued, talk of numbers, future targets, projected growth. White noise. I let my hand slip to my phone resting on my lap. Pressed the side button, the black screen lit up. My own reflection stared back. Eyes darker than before. Face a little more still. A little more carved in stone. I held that gaze for a moment longer than necessary. Not to search for weakness, but to remember pain. Yes. But underneath it, something fiercer. Unyielding. I turned the screen off, tucked the phone away. Ryan thought he had embarrassed me, exposed me. All he had done was cut the last thread that tethered my loyalty to this place. I sat through the rest of the meeting without hearing a word. Not out of spite, out of clarity. When you realize you owe them nothing. Not your anger, not your sadness, not even your fight. There's a freedom in that, a terrible, beautiful kind of freedom. And I embraced it silently while the world around me pretended nothing had changed. The office emptied faster than usual after the town hall, conversations, clipped footsteps brisk. Only the soft whir of the vending machine kept me company. As I sat alone at my desk, the city's dying light stretching long shadows across the floor. I plugged in the small flash drive, black, nondescript, unremarkable to anyone but me. Inside it, months of quiet preparation. Screenshots, emails. Server logs, expense reports altered in the dead of night. All signed in one way or another by Ryan. I opened a clean email draft, addressed it to the CEO to HR, and to be safe, a discreet third-party legal contact I trusted beyond the walls of this office. No grand accusations, no dramatic subject lines, just facts laid out with the cold precision they deserved. I hesitated only for a breath, then clicked. Send. The email slipped into the system without a sound. For a few seconds, nothing changed. Then the first ping echoed down the hallway. A second, a third. Across the empty desks, screens began flashing. Notification bubbles stacked like falling dominoes. Unauthorized access detected. File discrepancy report generated. Client data error logged. From the break room, someone cursed under their breath. My dashboard just locked me out. Another voice floated over. Is anyone else seeing like 15 error messages at once? I leaned back, watching the ripples grow. What had started as whispers of doubt would now roar into something Ryan couldn't quiet down, with a charming smile or a sharp reprimand. It wasn't about revenge. It was about truth. And the truth, when planted carefully enough, didn't need shouting to grow. I stood up, adjusting the cuff of my blouse, slowly, methodically. Ritual more than necessity. My hand brushed my phone, resting on the desk screen, still dark. I caught my faint reflection. Not victorious, not vengeful. Just steady, whole, walking toward the elevators. I passed Ryan's office. His door stood open, a bright square of fluorescent light spilling into the dark hallway. Inside his jacket hung limply over the chair. emails pinging furiously on his laptop. He wasn't there, not yet. But when he returned, he would find the first cracks. Tiny at first hairline fractures along the polished glass he'd built his empire on. By tomorrow, there would be no hiding them. The elevator doors slid open with a soft sigh. I stepped inside, not looking back. They thought they had pushed me out quietly, but I had never been the one breaking. I had simply been waiting. Have you ever had to silently fight back against injustice? Share your story. Someone out there would understand. Someone out there was waiting too. The company bled faster than anyone could patch it. By morning, the error reports had turned into full system failures. Client databases crashed, contracts vanished from the archive, calls poured in angry, confused, urgent. No amount of apologetic emails could mend it. No quick meeting could undo it. Ryan tried. Oh, he tried. He held frantic meetings behind closed doors. He barked orders down hallways, his voice fraying at the edges. He promised executives that everything was under control, even as their dashboards flickered red. But power once cracked doesn't hold, it crumbles. By noon, department heads stopped answering his summons. By 2 emails from the board began to surface terse and chilling, requesting immediate clarification regarding security breaches, unauthorized approvals tied to your credentials, advising you step aside pending investigation. Ryan's usual allies, the ones who laughed a little too loudly at his jokes, suddenly found urgent reasons to be elsewhere. Eyes that once turned toward him now turned away. When the official announcement came, a simple email. No ceremony. Effective immediately. Ryan Turner has resigned from his position. No one clapped. No one gasped. The building simply exhaled. A long, tired breath. I stood by the break room window, the weak afternoon sun casting long shadows across the empty desks. In the reflection, I saw clusters of colleagues forming small groups, heads bent together murmuring low. I turned to leave, but a hand brushed my elbow. "Talia," someone said softly. I turned. It was Marissa, one of the project leads. She looked nervous at first, then squared her shoulders. "You were right," she said. "You carried more than anyone saw." Another voice joined hers. Then another. "We should have backed you sooner. You kept this place standing longer than any of us. You deserved better. Not loud, not dramatic, just small, steady truths dropped like pebbles into a long, silent pond." I didn't say much, just nodded once. Grateful, but also done. I wasn't waiting for apologies. I wasn't waiting for recognition. Their words weren't medals to pin on my jacket. They were stones lifted off my backstones. I hadn't even realized I was still carrying. As I walked down the hallway, past Ryan's empty office, past the cracked foundation he'd tried to build a kingdom on, I didn't smile, I didn't celebrate. I simply moved forward. Each step light, each step mine. Justice hadn't arrived with fanfare. It had come the way most truths come. Quietly, inevitably. Absolutely. The lobby smelled faintly of polished marble and fresh coffee. The air felt clean. Lighter somehow. I stood in front of the reception desk, a slim folder tucked neatly under my arm, my heels clicking a soft, confident rhythm against the stone floor. A receptionist glanced up and smiled warmly. "Good morning, Ms. Hart. Welcome to Elysian." I smiled back, small, steady, not eager, not apologetic. She handed me a key card. "Executive suite. Take the elevator to the 23rd floor." I nodded, slipping the card into my blazer pocket. The lift doors whispered open. I stepped inside, alone. As the elevator rose floor by floor, I caught my reflection in the mirrored walls. Straight shoulders, clear eyes. Not the woman Westlake tried to diminish, the woman who survived it. The doors opened with a soft chime. The 23rd floor stretched out before me, wide, bright, quiet. Floor-to-ceiling windows spilled sunlight across sleek desks and glass partitions. The air hummed with quiet efficiency. not desperation. I moved forward. Each step landed firm and certain against the stone floor, echoing softly down the hall. A new rhythm, a new weight. An assistant approached, tablet in hand. "Ms. Hart, we're so glad you're here. The team's excited to meet you. First leadership meetings in 20 minutes whenever you're ready." Her voice held none of the clipped deference I'd grown used to. Just respect, simple, natural. I nodded once. "Thank you, I'll be there shortly." As she walked away, I paused for a moment by the floor-to-ceiling window. The city sprawled beyond the glass, unfolding in endless streets and unseen lives. Out there somewhere, Westlake continued its slow collapse. Out there, Ryan's name faded like a stain washed thin by time. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel regret. Only peace. I reached into my bag and pulled out a simple silver pen, a gift from a mentor long ago. I ran my thumb along the engraved words, "Build even when no one watches." At Westlake, they had watched, judged, undermined, dismissed. Here I would build anyway. Not because they cheered, but because it was who I had always been. The assistant returned, smiling slightly. "Ready, Ms. Hart?" I tucked the pen into my blazer pocket, adjusted the cuff at my wrist, turned from the window. "Let's get started," I said. We moved toward the conference room, my footsteps falling clean and sure behind me. No hesitation, no looking over my shoulder. The stone floor caught the sun and threw it back in soft gleams around me. Each step etched itself into that brightness. Not as an outsider clawing for space, not as a survivor clinging to scraps, but as someone who belonged, fully finely. In a world that tried to erase me, I had carved out something untouchable, my worth, my voice, my place, and this time no one could take it away. The first time I stood in front of them, I saw pieces of myself staring back. Young faces, eager, anxious, guarded in ways they probably didn't even realize yet. We gathered in one of the smaller conference rooms. No sleek podiums, no big stage lights, just a few chairs pulled into a loose circle, a pot of lukewarm coffee, and the kind of silence that hangs when people aren't sure if they're welcome yet. I set my notes down but didn't pick them up. Notes weren't what they needed. "I'm not here to lecture," I said, voice steady, easy. "I'm here because once, not so long ago, someone made me believe I was small. Replaceable." A ripple moved through the room. Subtle. Real. I leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on my knees. And it took me longer than I'd like to admit to realize the only person who gets to measure your worth is you. A young man near the back shifted his sneakers, squeaking softly against the floor. A woman with bright red glasses looked down at her notebook, fingers tapping an uncertain rhythm. I smiled, small but certain. You're going to hear a lot of voices in your career. Some will tell you you're not ready, that you're too quiet, too bold, too different. I let that settle, let it sting a little the way truth needs to. But here's the thing, I continued, voice softening. You get to decide which voices stay. They listened not with polite nods, but with the kind of stillness that comes when someone hears something they didn't know they needed. Across the room, someone raised a tentative hand. How do you know when it's time to leave a place that doesn't see you? I breathed in slowly, letting the question hang there, real heavy important. You'll feel it, I said, in the quiet spaces between tasks, in the way your shoulders stay tense even after the meeting ends, in the silence after you speak up and no one really listens. Another pause. No one checked their phones, no one shifted to leave. Leaving isn't weakness. I said, it's planting yourself somewhere you can actually grow. One by one, they started to open up, small stories, little bruises left by careless bosses, missed promotions, ideas dismissed with a smile. They weren't asking for revenge. They were asking to be seen. That's what this was about. Not burning old bridges, not settling old scores. Building something better, stronger, wider. When the session ended, they didn't rush out. They lingered, asking questions, sharing notes, laughing a little quiet. Uncertain laughter, but laughter still. I stayed answering every question, listening more than speaking. It wasn't a lecture. It was a beginning. Later, when the room had emptied, I stood by the window, overlooking the city's sprawl. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the floor. My reflection met me in the glass. Not a survivor anymore, not even just a leader, a builder, a mentor. Someone who knew that power wasn't about how loudly you spoke, it was about how deeply you listened. And that real legacy, it wasn't built by tearing things down. It was built by lifting others up. We all carry scars from battles no one else saw. Moments when we gave our best, only to be dismissed with a nod, a shrug, a closed door. It stays with you, doesn't it? That quiet ache of knowing you were worth more than the world chose to see, of hearing your own voice echo in empty rooms where no one bothered to listen. But here's the truth, they never tell you. Being undervalued doesn't mean you have no value. It means you are standing in a place too small to hold your worth. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do isn't to shout louder. It's to walk away, to plant yourself somewhere better, to rebuild yourself stronger. If my story resonates with you, if you've ever sat at a desk staring at a screen that reflected everything they failed to recognize in you, I want you to know you're not alone and you were never small. Have you ever been unjustly undervalued at work? What did you do afterward? I would love to hear your story. Drop it in the comments below. Let's build a space where the overlooked, the underestimated, and the quietly resilient can find each other, because sometimes healing starts not with fixing the past, but with being seen by those who understand. I'm listening, we're listening. Your story matters. Effective immediately, your salary will be adjusted according to new departmental savings policies. No greeting, no explanation. No signature, just silence dressed in formal language. If you have ever received a message so hollow, it made you question whether you existed at all. Stay with me. This is not a story about anger. It is about what happens when silence is used as a weapon. I stared at the screen. My hand hovered above the trackpad, motionless. The cursor blinked on the white page, patient and unfeeling. Outside the glass walls, the office moved in its normal rhythm. Chairs scraping against floors. Phones ringing. Laughter rising somewhere from the break room. I sat still as if the world had decided to move past me without notice. 3 days ago, I closed a $3 million deal. I still remembered the moment the client finally said yes, the way my heart had thudded against my ribs after months of careful negotiation. I remembered thinking just for a second that maybe everything was finally aligning. I lifted the mirror slightly. For a fleeting instant, I saw myself upside down, distorted. A stranger stared back at me. I placed the mirror face down again. Some things did not need to be seen twice. The blinds were half shut, cutting the office into long slashes of dusty light. The air was heavy, filled with the hum of machines that pretended nothing was wrong. My coffee mug sat on the desk, forgotten cold. I lifted it out of habit. Empty. I set it back down carefully, aligning it with the edge of my desk, as if that tiny act of precision could anchor me to something that had not yet been taken away. Another email arrived, a team meeting scheduled for later today. My name was not on the attendee list. Outside, 2 colleagues passed my door, their voices low, their footsteps quickening as they caught sight of me. They already knew. I folded my hands together on the desk, feeling the chill seep into my skin. Not fear, not sadness. Something quieter. A shift. They thought they had made a quiet adjustment, a faceless cut. They thought wrong. I closed the email without replying, without saving it. Let it sit there floating in the digital void where forgotten things go to die. The light changed on the floor. The sun moved across the sky without asking my permission. I stood up slowly, the chair sliding back with a faint scrape against the tiles. My movements were deliberate, unhurried. The mirror stayed face down, the coffee mug stayed empty. I left them both behind. No dramatic exit, no angry speeches, only the quiet knowledge that something inside me had realigned, and that no one in this building would see it coming until it was far too late. They had made their choice. Now it was my turn. The folder was still sitting in the center of my desk, where I had left it after the celebration call 3 nights ago. A slim white folder with a thin blue ribbon, a small formality the company used whenever a major deal closed. A symbolic gesture, a ceremonial pat on the back. I reached for it now, with a mechanical slowness, as if some part of me already knew what I was about to see. My fingertips brushed the edge first. Cool. Too still. I pulled the folder toward me and flipped it open. The contract stared back at me. Line after line of black ink clauses, negotiated with surgical precision deadlines, inked with absolute finality, and at the bottom of the last page, my signature. Except it wasn't right. The ink had bled across the paper, smudging the tail of my name into a shapeless blur. It looked like something had pressed against it before it dried. Something careless, something impatient. I stared at it longer than necessary, letting the wrongness of it seep into my skin. $3 million, secured closed. Celebrated. And yet the very proof of it had been stained blurred until it barely held form. A mistake, an accident, or a message. I traced the blurred line with my eyes, refusing to touch it. It felt sacred now, in a twisted way. A physical mark of how little even my greatest victories meant inside these walls. Behind me, a printer whirred to life, spitting out documents with mindless efficiency. Life continued without pause. I pressed my palms flat against the desk, feeling the grain of the wood against my skin steady, solid. Unlike the words on the page, the sunlight shifted again, creeping higher across the floor, casting the smudged ink into sharper relief. Even the light seemed to mock it now. I closed the folder gently and set it aside, as if tucking away something broken that could not be repaired. It did not matter anymore. Not here. I leaned back in my chair, letting my head tilt against the leather headrest. For a moment, I closed my eyes, listening. The muted tapping of keyboards, the distant rumble of the elevator, the faint hum of fluorescent lights breathing down on all of us. None of it felt real. Somewhere in the break room, someone opened a soda can with a sharp hiss. Laughter followed. I opened my eyes slowly. The ceiling lights fragmenting into long, sterile bars across my vision. They would pretend not to know. They would act as if this adjustment, this erasure was normal. Expected, just another policy shift. But the bleeding ink told a different story. It told me that even before the email, even before the salary cut, the story had already been written. Not in clean lines, but in careless smudges. The room smelled faintly of toner and coffee, gone stale. Familiar. Oppressive. I turned my head slightly and caught my reflection in the darkened window. A faint outline, a suggestion more than a presence. For a second, I wondered if anyone would even notice when I was gone. Would anyone pause? Would anyone ask? Or would the stain of my absence simply be another smudge on someone else's paperwork hastily wiped away? My hands were steady now as I pushed the folder away. It slid across the desk with a soft, final whisper. Across the hall, I saw my manager pass by. He did not look in, his shoulders were hunched, his pace too fast to be casual. Good, let them think I was folding quietly. Let them think I was too stunned to move. I picked up my pen and uncapped it slowly, feeling the soft click of plastic and metal. I wrote. Nothing. I only held it there, poised above a blank page, as if the act of holding the possibility of words was enough. The clock ticked above the door. An unhurried reminder that time belonged to no one, least of all to the ones who thought they controlled it. I slid the blank paper into my drawer, closed it, and rose from my chair. The air shifted slightly as I moved, a rustle against a world that preferred stillness. I walked to the window, resting one hand lightly against the cool glass. Outside the city stretched toward the horizon, vast and indifferent. Somewhere out there, real decisions were waiting to be made. Not here, not under fluorescent lights and paper cuts disguised as policies. Without looking back, I whispered to the glass, a promise only I needed to hear. Not yet. But soon, the hallway felt colder than usual. I stepped out of my office and paused, letting the heavy door click shut behind me. My heels made soft, deliberate sounds against the tiled floor, but no one looked up. As I approached the main work area, I waited for the sensor lights to flicker on. They didn't. I took another step forward, still nothing. The hallway ahead remained half-shadowed, as if the building itself had decided I no longer belonged. For a moment, I stood still, caught between instinct and realization, the kind that does not hit all at once, but creeps in slowly. I raised my hand, waving once at the invisible detector above. Nothing. I lowered my hand, letting it fall back to my side with careful mechanical grace. The light had always recognized me before, even when no one else did. Now, even it had turned away. I continued walking my pace, unbroken, the muted clack of my heels slicing through the dimness. Shadows stretched long across the floor. A group huddled near the far end, chatting low over coffee. No one glanced at me. I could have been a ghost drifting through a building already erasing me as I passed the corner where the hall opened into the main floor. I caught my reflection, faint fractured across a glass pane. I adjusted the folder in my hands, feeling its weight. The contract I had closed, the one they had stained. No one said my name, no one nodded. The light stayed dark until I pressed the switch at the wall. The overheads buzzed hesitantly to life, casting a thin beam over my shoulders. It was not welcome light. It was acknowledgement by force. If you have ever walked through a place you once gave your heart to and realized you were invisible, you will understand. You will know the kind of silence that is not empty but full of what is no longer said, full of what will never be said again. You will know what it feels like to exist in a place that has forgotten you. If you have ever felt that, stay with me, because this story is far from over. I turned left at the break room, feeling the faint change in the floor under my shoes. Inside, the air was thicker, heavy with burned coffee. Someone laughed again, a little too loudly, a little too hard. I moved to the counter, pretending to pour myself a cup. My hand gripped the handle of the pot, fingertips pressing harder than necessary. The pot was almost empty. Only a shallow pool sat at the bottom. I set it down with a clink, letting the sound punctuate the room. No one looked over. Good. I did not want them to see me. I needed them to forget I was ever there. The less they saw, the less they would understand when everything changed. I turned the empty cup still in my hand and walked back into the hallway. The sensor lights sputtered again as I moved. This time, I did not wait. Some lights recognize you because they are programmed to. Some lights go out because someone decided you were no longer needed. But sometimes it is you who chooses not to turn them back on. I kept walking until the shadows swallowed the last of the flickering beams behind me. The wall-sized bulletin board had always been a silent witness. It covered nearly the entire side of the workspace, a patchwork of project plans, milestones, deadlines, and photos of teams. Mid-celebration, caught in blurry triumph, my name had once appeared across half the markers. Now it was just blank. I walked toward it slowly, my fingers trailing lightly over the cool edge of the nearest cubicle. The familiar scuff of my shoes against the carpet felt too loud, like an uninvited sound in a place that had quietly moved on. The closer I came, the more I saw entire sections had been stripped bare. Colored pins once, holding reports, strategy maps. Client wins, now stuck into nothing, just small punctures on a fabric of gray, like a map where the landmarks had been pulled out by invisible hands. My steps slowed. I stopped in front of it, letting the blankness settle in my chest like dust. The corner where my last project plan had hung was empty. A few faded outlines still clung to the board, sun-bleached squares where papers had shielded the fabric underneath. Ghost of what once was, I reached up and plucked one of the empty pins out of the board. It resisted for a second, like a reluctant goodbye. Then it gave way with a tiny snap, leaving behind a hole barely wide enough to notice, unless you knew where to look. I turned the pin between my fingers, feeling the faint ridges where the plastic molded into cheap red plastic. Nothing precious, nothing sacred, just a small disposable thing. Like so many promises made inside these walls, I pocketed the pin without thinking. A souvenir of something they had tried to erase but could not rewrite completely. From the corner of my eye, I saw a pair of coworkers passing by. They lowered their voices as they moved, quickening their steps without looking in my direction. I pressed my thumb against the empty hole where the pin had been, the slight roughness of the fabric catching against my skin. They wanted the board to forget me, they wanted the world to forget me, but the gaps were still there, silent testimonies to the spaces I had once filled. I stepped back slowly, letting the full wall come into view. Not just my projects, not just my plans, but entire sections stripped, hollowed out, as if in erasing me, they had accidentally erased a little more than they meant to. The overhead lights buzzed faintly. The air tasted slightly metallic, like the edge of a forgotten storm. I let my hand fall to my side, the small pin still warm in my palm. No anger, no sadness. Only the quiet understanding that some losses are invisible until you look at what has been left behind. I turned away from the board. I did not want pity from it. I did not want nostalgia, only recognition. And that even without anyone speaking my name, I had taken up space they could not so easily refill. As I walked back toward my desk, I passed a cluster of new faces. They barely glanced up, the way tourists might skim past a ruin without understanding its history. Good better they did not understand. Some marks are not meant to be read by those who never bothered to write them. I returned to my desk, placing the pin carefully inside the shallow drawer between a loose paperclip and an old, unused ID badge. Artifacts of a life lived quietly but lived all the same. The sun shifted again outside, casting long, slanted shadows across the rows of empty desks. I sat down, letting the quiet fold around me like a second skin. Some losses you mourn, some you wear like armor. I was learning the difference. The login screen blinked coldly at me. Username, password, the same sequence I had typed hundreds of times without thought, without question. Muscle memory, guiding fingers faster than reason. Today, though, my hands moved slower. Deliberate, measured, each keystroke a quiet farewell. I entered my credentials and paused, my finger hovering over the enter key. For a moment, I allowed myself to imagine what would happen if I simply stopped. If I pulled my hand away, closed the laptop, and disappeared without a trace. But silence, no matter how powerful, still needed an ending. A punctuation mark I pressed. Enter access granted. The familiar dashboard loaded full of client portfolios, internal memos, schedules for projects I would never complete. Files I had built. Accounts I had salvaged. All of it still pretending I belonged. I navigated to the security settings with a few efficient clicks. My hands barely trembled. Only the tiniest catch of my breath betrayed anything at all. Change password, deactivate user. The options lay before me, like two doors, one leading to slow fading, the other to complete vanishing. I chose the second. I moved through the steps with precision. Erasing access points. Resetting authentications, untangling myself from the network. One login at a time. Each confirmation screen felt lighter than the last, like unlatching a chain I hadn't realized had been growing heavier around my neck. I deleted old saved passwords from the company drive, disabled auto-forwarding on the client accounts, logged out of messaging platforms, closing conversations that had long gone stale. One by one, doors closed behind me, and I did not look back through any of them. The last step was simple. One final click to deactivate my profile. I hovered there for a moment, watching the cursor pulse over the screen. A single thought cut through the noise. They had not fired me, not officially, but they had made it impossible for me to stay. I would not give them the satisfaction of watching me stumble. If they were going to forget me, I would make sure they had nothing left to hold on to. My finger pressed down. Deactivate, confirm. The system processed the request, a small spinning icon marking the end of something vast and unseen. Account disabled. Just like that, like I had never been there at all. I closed the laptop carefully, the screen folding down with a quiet sigh. My reflection caught briefly on the black surface, a ghost framed in silver edges. I watched myself fade into the closing dark. And let it happen. The office around me continued humming. Oblivious. Phones rang. Printer's word laughter floated through the corridors, tinny and hollow. I stood slowly, running a hand along the smooth surface of my desk. No papers, no pens, no traces. Even the chair, when pushed in, looked like it had never been pulled out. The sunlight had shifted again, longer and lower now, brushing my shoulders. With a cold, pale glow. I could feel the dust in the air, glittering briefly in the slanted light, dancing for no one. My fingertips grazed the edge of the monitor one last time, not as a farewell, but as a seal, as if pressing my absence into the plastic and glass. Across the floor, I saw my manager standing by the printer, his back turned, talking, laughing, living as if nothing had changed. Good. They would only realize later, when the passwords stopped working, when the accounts failed to load, when the gaps widened into fractures no one could cross. They would scramble, they would search, they would remember. But by then, I would be long gone. I slipped my laptop into the empty drawer, turned off the desk lamp, straightened the chair. Everything in place. Everything just so. As if no one had been there at all, I took a final look around the room, a room that had already forgotten me, long before I chose to forget it back. And then, without a word, without a ripple, I walked away. The key was heavier than I remembered. I found it tucked deep in the pocket of my blazer. A simple metal key attached to a worn leather tag, with my name faintly embossed. A key to the small conference room at the end of the hall, the one reserved for high-stakes meetings, closed-door negotiations, secret victories. Once carrying it had meant something. Now it was just an artifact from a story I no longer believed in. I rolled the key between my fingers as I walked, feeling the sharp edges catch lightly against my skin. Not enough to cut, just enough to remind. The hallway stretched ahead of me, empty and silent, except for the faint hum of the vents breathing overhead. Every few steps, the motion sensors flickered uncertainly, struggling to keep pace with my steady approach. I reached the door of the conference room. It looked smaller than I remembered, dimmer, like a stage abandoned after the actors had long since slipped away. For a moment, I stood still. Key gripped lightly in my hand. Memories flitted at the edges of my mind. Closed-door talks, inked contracts, laughter muffled behind polished wood. None of it mattered now. None of it had ever mattered the way I thought it did. I pushed the door open with my shoulder and stepped inside. The room smelled faintly of dust and old coffee. The long mahogany table gleamed under the sickly fluorescent lights, barren, except for a single glass coaster left forgotten near the far end. I walked to the center of the table, heels clicking softly against the floor. Every step measured and final. Then I placed the key down. Face up. Not dropped, not tossed. Placed intentionally squarely so that anyone who found it would understand it had been left, not lost. The tag caught the light, the embossed letters glinting faintly. Camille, still there even as the world around it tried to pretend otherwise. I stared at it for a moment, letting the silence stretch and deepen, letting the act settle in the air like a note held long after the music had stopped. The key did not belong to me anymore, but it also did not belong to them. It simply existed. Unclaimed, I ran a finger lightly over the smooth leather tag, feeling the slight wear at the edges. 1,000 small frictions that had softened it over time. just like me, worn perhaps, but never broken. I straightened, smoothing the front of my jacket with a small, steadying gesture. My reflection caught faintly in the polished wood of the table. A shifting silhouette, more idea than person. Some things once surrendered could never be taken back, and some departures once chosen could never be reversed. I turned away without a backward glance. The door clicked softly shut behind me, sealing the room and everything it had once meant into the past. As I walked back toward the main hall, the air felt lighter, sharper, tinged with something almost electric, like the first breeze before a coming storm. Every step away from that room was a step back toward myself, toward something not yet written, but mine, finally mine. If you have ever stood at the edge of something you once thought you needed, and realized you could leave without bitterness, without rage, only with quiet certainty, then you know what I felt in that moment? And if you have ever reached a point where returning was no longer an option, not because the door was locked, but because you simply no longer wanted to step through it, then stay with me, because we are just getting started. I paused by the elevator, pressing the call button, with the same calm deliberation that had guided every step of my morning. The light above the doors blinked once slowly, as if uncertain. I smiled to myself. A small, private smile. Uncertainty was no longer my enemy. The elevator arrived with a soft chime. I stepped inside alone. The doors closed with a quiet hush, sealing me away from the floor. The office, the fading remnants of a life I no longer claimed. And as the elevator descended, I felt it not falling, not shrinking, but rising inside myself, steady and inevitable. Some exits are not escapes, they are declarations. Mine had only just begun. The phone vibrated against the surface of the table, rattling just enough to pull me back from the drift of my own thoughts. I hadn't expected it to ring. Not today. Not on the day I had decided to vanish. The name flashed on the screen. Not the company's main line. Not an internal extension. A direct number. A name I knew too well. Michael Reeves. Senior Vice President, Northbridge Tech, the client that had built the foundation of my portfolio, and by extension, a third of the revenue that kept this office afloat. The same client they had let me walk away from without a second glance. I let the phone vibrate once, twice, feeling the buzz against my fingertips, the tremor of something shifting far below the surface. Then I answered, "Camille." His voice cracked slightly, like he had started to speak, before realizing what he needed to say. "Is everything all right? We've been trying to get a status update. No one's answering." I leaned back in my chair, letting the silence hang between us for a beat longer than necessary, just long enough for the weight of it to sink in. "I'm not sure I'm the right person to ask anymore," I said calmly. Another pause on his end, the kind of pause where realization starts to crystallize, but hasn't yet found its words. "What does that mean?" he asked, finally. Voice lower, sharper now, I watched a stray beam of sunlight cut across the floor, painting slanted lines over the empty desks. "It means," I said, "you might want to reach out to someone officially." I could almost hear him sit back in his chair. Could almost picture the way he would rub a hand over his face when frustration edged into disbelief. "Camille," he said again, softer now, "you handled everything. You were the reason we stayed through the last renewal." I didn't reply. There was nothing left to explain, nothing left to negotiate. The silence grew heavier. A second pulse beneath the ordinary noise of the building, keys clacking, phones ringing. Lives continuing without knowing, the ground had already begun to crack. "I need you to be straight with me," Michael said finally. "Are you still with them?" I stared at the muted screensaver bouncing lazily across the monitor. "No," I said, "not anymore." Another beat of silence, then a sigh deep resigned. "We'll be in touch," he said, voice clipped now, professional, calculating, not angry, just adjusting, because men like Michael Reeves didn't panic. They pivoted. They followed the value, and I had just made it clear where that value no longer lived. The call ended without a goodbye. Just a click. A severing. I set the phone down gently, feeling the subtle reverberation through the desk. Not violent, not dramatic. Just final. Across the room, my manager appeared in the doorway to the break room, holding a coffee cup, laughing at something unseen. Still oblivious. Still perched atop a structure that had already begun to sway. Good. Let them laugh a little longer. Let them sip their coffee, answer their emails, plan their pointless meetings. The call had been quiet, private, but its aftershock would not be soon. They would feel it. The slow withdrawal of trust, the tightening of budgets, the unexpected silence when contracts went unsigned, and they would look for someone to blame. But they would be looking too late. I smoothed a hand over the surface of my desk, the motion slow and deliberate, like brushing away the last grains of sand from a sculpture no longer meant to stand. The sunlight had shifted again, drawing the shadows longer, deeper. I stood up, letting the quiet fold around me like armor. If you have ever been the keystone of something and realized in one breathless moment that you had the power to walk away and let it fall, then you know exactly what I felt. And if you have ever watched a wall crack without lifting a finger to stop it, knowing it was not your burden to hold anymore, then stay close, because the real collapse was still to come. I picked up my phone, slipped it into my bag, and walked slowly toward the elevators. Behind me, the hum of office life continued, for now. But the first call had been made, the first thread had been pulled, and the unraveling had already begun. The coffee shop smelled like new beginnings. Not the cloying, overly sweet kind, the real kind. Sharp notes of roasted beans, worn wood paper crinkling beneath careful hands. I sat by the window, the small table barely large enough for my laptop and a battered leather notebook. No logos, no watermarked stationery, no branded pens lying in neat corporate lines. Just me and a blank page, the first true silence I had heard in years. Outside, the city moved at its usual restless pace, cars honking distantly, footsteps scraping sidewalks, conversations floating half-formed past the glass. But none of it touched me, none of it demanded anything from me. I opened the notebook first. The pages smelled faintly of ink and dust, clean untouched, a space where no one had yet decided who I was supposed to be. My fingers hesitated over the first line. Old habits itched under my skin. The need to plan to strategize, to anticipate who might judge what I wrote next. I let the hesitation pass without feeding it. No mission statements. No objectives to meet. No targets to hit. This time, it would be different. I wrote a name at the top of the page. My own. Not the company's, not any client's, mine. Camille Harper, a line drawn firmly beneath it. Not because I needed anyone to recognize it, but because I needed to recognize myself. The coffee on the table grew cold as the first ideas began to sketch themselves out in slow, careful strokes. Not a business plan, not yet, just directions. Instincts taking shape in words. Consulting strategy, partnerships chosen, not inherited. Clients who valued clarity over politics. People who wanted results, not performances. A life lived without waiting for permission. I glanced up briefly and caught my reflection in the window. Not clear, not sharp, but there, present, whole. The light outside shifted clouds, breaking apart, to let in thin, reluctant streams of sun. Across the street, a delivery truck idled the driver, tapping the steering wheel with 2 fingers, impatient for something unseen. Everything moved forward, even when you thought it had paused. I picked up my laptop and opened a fresh document. No templates. No corporate headers. Just a blank screen waiting. I began drafting the first outreach notes. Not desperate pleas for attention. Not polished performances meant to impress. Simple, clear messages. This is what I know. This is how I can help. This is the standard I will not lower again. I saved the document under a single word. Foundation. Not revenge, not redemption. foundation, a quiet reclaiming of what had been stripped away piece by piece, while I smiled and nodded and played roles that no longer fit. As the afternoon wore on, and the coffee shop filled and emptied around me, students hunched over laptops, elderly couples sharing quiet cups of tea, businessmen barking orders into phones. None of them noticed the woman by the window, writing herself back into the world without fanfare. Good. I did not need witnesses. I only needed momentum. If you have ever chosen to rebuild not because you were broken, but because you refused to be reduced, then you will understand. And if you have ever found peace not in winning back what was lost, but in creating something no one else could touch, then stay with me, because the real story, the one written in your own hand, does not ask for applause. It only asks for honesty. The barista called out an order at the counter. Breaking the heavy hum of the afternoon, a doorbell chimed faintly as someone left. I closed my notebook carefully, the pages now marked with the first map I had chosen for myself. Not a destination, not a guarantee, but a beginning. I did not need permission for. I packed up my things, slid the laptop into a worn leather bag, and rose from the table. The air outside hit me cool and sharp, threading its way into my jacket, into my lungs. It tasted like freedom, and it was only just beginning. The email arrived late in the evening, when the city had already begun to hush itself into sleep. It slipped into my inbox like a hand reaching out in the dark, hesitant, almost shy. No subject line shouting urgency, no bold letters demanding attention. Just a soft, almost apologetic title. Camille, let's talk. I clicked it open without expectation. The message was short. Shorter than I would have guessed. Too careful, too measured. They wanted a conversation, a renegotiation, they said, a chance to rebuild the bridge. They had accidentally strained. I leaned back in my chair, letting the words hang there in the dim light of my apartment. No anger bubbled up. No satisfaction either. Only a deep, unwavering calm. They were not reaching out because they missed me. They were reaching out because the cracks had started to show. Because Northbridge Tech had called back. Because the numbers had begun to slip. Because for the first time, the hollow spaces I left behind were becoming too wide to paper over. The timing said everything. They hadn't called when they erased my projects. They hadn't called when they cut my salary behind a faceless email. They hadn't called when I walked out with nothing but silence in my wake. They only called now. Now when it was no longer about me, but about them. I reread the message slowly, as if peeling away layers of dust. The words were polite, professional, almost tender in their caution. It was the language of people who had learned too late that some losses are not reversible. I closed the laptop without replying. There was no bitterness in the act, no resentment gnawing at the edges, only clarity. I poured myself a glass of water from the kitchen sink, the faucet squeaking slightly in protest. The simple weight of the glass in my hand felt more real than anything they could offer now. Outside the window, the city lights blurred against the dark rivers of gold threading through a landscape that no longer needed my participation to feel alive. I sipped slowly, letting the coolness slide across my tongue. If you have ever been offered something only after you stopped needing it, you will understand. And if you have ever realized that validation coming too late is no validation at all, then you will know exactly why. I smiled quietly into the night. I set the glass down carefully on the counter. No grand gestures, no final words. Just a simple choice made without fanfare. I would not reply. Not because I was punishing them, but because I had outgrown the need to be seen by people who only recognized value when it slipped from their grasp. I moved to the window, resting my hand lightly against the cool glass. The reflection that met me was steady, clear, unshaken. I no longer needed their bridges. I had already built my own shore. They would have to find their way without me, and I would continue forward, unburdened, unbound. Because sometimes the most powerful revenge is no revenge at all. It is simply choosing not to return. The first time I saw their calls piling up, I felt nothing. 7 missed calls, 2 voicemails, an email marked urgent. I stared at the notifications stacked on my phone, each one a thread pulling tighter around a knot that no longer belonged to me. They weren't calling out of care. They were calling out of fear. I set the phone face down on the table, the soft click against the wood sounding final. Outside the window, the day faded into bruised purples and sullen golds, the kind of sky that warned of storms without making a sound. I leaned back into the couch, the leather cool against my skin, and let the silence stretch. They were scrambling now, trying to fix what they had never bothered to see cracking beneath them, but I was no longer there to hold up the beams. No longer the quiet scaffolding they leaned against without gratitude. The balance had shifted. They just hadn't realized yet how far I picked up the photo frame from the edge of the coffee table, a simple black border framing a picture of the ocean at dawn. No people, no declarations, just open water, endless and unmapped. It had been a gift to myself after closing that $3 million deal, a reminder that some victories were personal and didn't need anyone else's applause. I traced the edge of the frame with my thumb, feeling the faint texture of the grain beneath the smooth finish. Not all anchors are chains, some are choices. I placed the frame back down and rose, stretching slowly, letting the stiffness work itself out of my muscles. The apartment was bathed in the last lazy light of evening. Dust motes floated through the air, catching in shafts of gold. Everything felt still, solid. I crossed to the kitchen and filled a glass of water, watching the clear stream twist and dance before settling. The phone buzzed again. Another missed call, another message left unheard. I smiled slightly, not unkindly. It was not cruelty that kept me from answering. It was understanding. Understanding that there is no virtue in saving people from the consequences they chose to ignore. If you have ever realized that walking away is not an act of bitterness, but of self-respect, you will understand this moment. And if you have ever stood on the edge of the life they tried to trap you in and chosen not to step back, you know the freedom woven into every breath. After I turned off the phone, completely setting it aside, like a chapter I had finished reading, let them call. Let them send desperate emails and offer last-minute deals. Let them circle the ruins, pretending surprise. They were not mourning my loss. They were mourning their own blindness, and they would have to rebuild without me. On broken ground with hollow foundations, I wrapped a light jacket around my shoulders and stepped out onto the small balcony overlooking the city. Below, the lights twinkled like scattered gold dust, oblivious to the small human dramas unfolding within them. I rested my arms on the cool metal railing, breathing in the sharp bite of the evening air. No one needed to know what had been taken from me. No one needed to know what I had chosen to leave behind. The only thing that mattered was this. I had walked away before the collapse, and I had not looked back. Some exits are not defeats. They are victories measured in silence, not in applause. The ones left calling, left wondering, left piecing together the gaps. They were not my burden anymore. They were just echoes in a story I no longer belonged to. And I was already writing another. News traveled faster than I expected. By the end of the week, Northbridge Tech had officially pulled their accounts. Other clients followed, cautious calculating, unwilling to gamble loyalty where stability had fractured. The company scrambled frantic emails. Emergency meetings, blame whispered through corridors too thin to hold their weight. I heard about it in pieces. A former colleague's text message. A LinkedIn update riddled with half-truths and urgent optimism. They tried to hide it, of course, the way crumbling structures always do, with polished smiles and press releases, crafted to sound like strategy, not surrender. But I knew better. You can't repair foundations you never respected in the first place. I sat in the same coffee shop by the window, a fresh notebook open in front of me, untouched. Outside the city pulsed forward, indifferent to a company's quiet fall. The sunlight caught the glass, throwing fractured rainbows across my table. I traced one absent-mindedly with my finger, a soft arc against the wood. No anger filled me. No triumph either. Only a profound stillness. The kind of stillness that comes when you realize you never needed to fight for a seat at a crumbling table. Across town, they were probably drafting emails, offering apologies, spinning failures into lessons learned. It didn't matter anymore. Their story was still being written in broken sentences, fractured by hands too late to steady the page. Mine had already turned to another chapter. If you have ever seen something fall apart from a distance and felt nothing but relief, you will understand this silence. It was not cruelty, it was clarity. I closed the notebook without writing a word. Not every story demands to be recorded. Some are better left to fade, swallowed by the dust they once kicked up with so much noise. I stood gathering my things, moving slowly, deliberately. Behind me, the rainbow on the table faded as the sun shifted. A brief, beautiful thing, gone without needing to announce its departure. Just like me, the sky stretched open above me, wide, clear, unapologetic. I walked without urgency, the streets unfamiliar but kind. No emails to answer. No deadlines gnawing at the edge of my mind. Only the rhythm of my own breath against the quiet pull of morning. The coffee shop on the corner had just opened, the smell of fresh bread and bitter roast curling into the air. I pushed the door open, the bell overhead chiming a soft, unhurried note. Inside the world was simple again. Chairs stacked neatly. Sunlight spilling across worn wooden floors. I ordered without thinking, the words natural in my mouth, not rehearsed for anyone's approval. One black coffee, nothing added. Nothing hidden. As I waited, I pulled a small notebook from my bag, the same one I had started weeks ago when the first lines of my new life had barely begun to form. The pages fluttered slightly in the breeze from the open window. Blank waiting, but not empty. I flipped to the first filled page and smiled. The handwriting was firm, unbroken mine. Entirely mine. The barista called my order, and I carried the cup carefully to a small table by the window. No laptops, no conference calls, no performative busyness. Just the steady, simple act of being. I sipped the coffee slowly, letting the warmth settle deep inside, letting the silence around me stretch and breathe. There were no trophies here, no applause, no audience to bear witness, but none of that mattered, because some victories are not meant to be displayed. Some victories live quietly inside you, growing stronger with every step you take away from places that tried to shrink you. If you have ever walked away, not in anger, not in bitterness, but in full, radiant certainty of your own worth, then you already know you are not invisible, you are not forgotten, you are becoming. If you have ever been seen too late, but learned to see yourself just in time, leave a mark here, even if it's just a single word. I will be reading quietly from the other side, and I will know you made it too.